Welcome to the What If It's Not Depression Vodcast. I'm your host, Dr. Achina Stein. And today I have a very special, close to my heart guest, Dr. Tom OBryan, joining us today. He is one of my mentors and one of the faculty members of the Institute for Functional Medicine. And we are going to talk about everything you need to know about gluten. So Dr. OBryan is considered the Sherlock Holmes for chronic disease and teaches that recognizing and addressing the underlying mechanisms that activate an immune response is the map to the highway towards better health. He holds teaching faculty positions, not just with the Institute for Functional Medicine, but also the National University of Health Sciences. He has trained and certified tens of thousands of practitioners around the world in advanced understanding of the impact of wheat sensitivity and the development of individual autoimmune diseases. He's written a book called The Autoimmune Fix, and it's an excellent book if you have concerns about getting an autoimmune disease and or have an autoimmune disease, and it's all connected to gluten, believe it or not. So if you like this episode, please click the like button and subscribe. Welcome, Dr. OBryan.
Thank you, Dr. Achina. Nice to see you again. Thank you.
Yeah. So let's just start from the top. What I get questions about over and over again is, I'll have someone tell me, Dr. Stein, my doctor did celiac testing and they said I don't have to worry about gluten, because I came up negative on the celiac panel. And so I don't need to, they said I don't need to cut out gluten. Why do you want me to do that now? And so I know that's like one question that opens up a whole can of worms, but I think it's so important for people to understand not just how to test celiac. Sometimes celiac disease isn't even tested properly. People aren't up to date with how to test for it. But also that's not the only reason to cut out gluten.
Yes. Okay. Oh, that's the question. Okay. I guess the analogy that just came up in my mind as you were speaking the question, your car's not running very well. And you take the car to mechanic, and the mechanic says, well, your tires are full of air. As if that's the answer. Right. I checked your tires, and they're all full of air. My body's not feeling very well. I've got fatigue, or I've got migraines, or my child's got attention deficit, or I've got psoriasis, or I've got rheumatoid arthritis. Well, we checked you for celiac, and it's not a problem. Mm-hmm. It's a historic misconception that celiac disease is the problem when your immune system is fighting wheat. Celiac disease is one of the possible problems when your immune system is fighting wheat.
Right.
But multiple sclerosis is one of the problems when your immune system is fighting wheat. Rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis, Hashimoto's thyroid, vitiligo, alopecia. It doesn't matter. The disease may be the manifestation of a problem with wheat. Now, wait a minute. How can that be? What are you saying here? I'm saying that we learned about the dangers of wheat for some people through the lens of celiac disease. And back in the 1950s and 60s, that's how we first learned about wheat can be a problem for some people. But now, for every one person that has gut symptoms, when their immune system is fighting wheat, there are 8 that don't. They've got, the ratio is 8 to 1. They've got brain symptoms or skin symptoms or joint symptoms or kidney symptoms or thyroid symptoms. They don't have gut symptoms. They don't have celiac disease.
Right.
So to restrict your evaluation of whether a food is good for you or not, and specifically wheat is good for you or not by whether or not you have celiac disease, is restricting the function of your car to if you have enough air in your tires. It's,
right.
I mean, we were just talking before we started the recording. My wife was just on a road trip this morning, looking forward to a morning solo without family, you know, on her own. And the car died. The car died, and she called me, and her tires are fine, but the car died. Well, no, it's okay. Your tires are fine. You don't have a problem with your tires, but I have thyroid disease.
Right.
I've got chronic fatigue. I've got recurrent sinus infections. Well, yeah, but you don't have celiac disease, so wheat's not a problem. Right. So we have to expand our horizon to understand how could wheat possibly be an issue in all these different diseases that I just referenced. And for that, it's really easy. There's 2 points to understand, and then you've got it that maybe wheat's a problem. The first is that the Center for Disease Control tells us that 14 of the 15 top causes of death in the world today are chronic inflammatory diseases. Everything except an unintentional injury is a chronic inflammatory disease of the 15 top causes of death. Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, diabetes, autoimmune diseases, depression, anxiety. They're chronic inflammatory diseases. And when you understand that, then you go down the rabbit hole of where's the inflammation coming from, right? So every person needs to understand, to be asking that question for them and their family. Am I inflamed right now? And where's the inflammation coming from? That's the first concept. And one more visual on concept number one. If you pull at a chain, the chain always breaks at the weakest link, always. And it's going to be at one end, the middle, the other end. It's going to be your gut, celiac disease, your thyroid, Hashimoto's, your brain, MS, or brain fog, or seizures. Wherever the weak link is in your chain, that's where the chain's going to break. And the pull on the chain is inflammation. Right. Always, without exception, it's always inflammation. And it's such a basic concept that doctors were never taught this. They don't emphasize the importance of an anti-inflammatory lifestyle. Critically important, and we could spend a weekend. People do their PhD thesis and spend 8 years on this topic to really dial it down. That's point number one. Point number two is, let's go to Professor Alessio Fasano at Harvard. He is a professor of medicine, Harvard Medical School, professor of nutrition, Harvard School of Public Health, the dean of the Celiac Research Center at Harvard, the director of mucosal immunology at Harvard, and the chief of pediatric gastroenterology at Mass General at Harvard. Right. This guy has 5 titles. Any one title is a lifelong dream for people at the top of their profession. He's got 5. We think he's going to win the Nobel Prize. We truly do. Because it was him and his team that identified the mechanism back in 1997 by which this thing, leaky gut, occurs. Right. He identified the mechanism. And for 25 years now, they've been writing paper after paper. Leaky gut and pancreas, here comes diabetes. Leaky gut and skin, here comes psoriasis. Leaky gut and brain, here comes brain fog, seizures, attention deficit, autism. The papers just consistently are telling us that the gut has something to do with all these other diseases. Right. So let's listen to Professor Fasano for a moment, who he's the author now, or a co-author, on somewhere around 300 papers. And usually his name's the last name, meaning he's the big kahuna that oversees everything that everyone is writing, right? But this paper he wrote by himself. And he is always so careful about what he says so that he's not misquoted. Every word that comes out of his mouth is a conscious word from him, right? So listen to the title of this paper. I printed out the first page of it for our interview here today. Listen to the title of this. And this is Solo with Fasano. All disease begins in the leaky gut. The
Wow.
role of the protein zonulin in the development of chronic inflammatory diseases. Now, 14 of the 15 top causes of death in the world today are chronic inflammatory diseases. And all disease begins in the leaky gut, and how the leaky gut contributes to the development of chronic inflammatory diseases. This is the head of 5 different, he's the head of 3 different departments at Harvard, and he's a professor of medicine, professor of nutrition. And this is what they're teaching at Harvard Medical School now, which is so cool. All disease begins in the leaky gut. And he talks about the perfect storm in the development of chronic inflammatory diseases. So when you have this big picture view, okay, wait a minute. Big picture number 1 is inflammation is the pull on the chain for the development of every disease.
Right.
Without exception, as far as I know, without exception, except one. If you have a salt deficiency, there's a problem that can develop in your brain, that central pontine myelinosis, which is not an inflammatory condition, but everything else, as far as I know. So, okay, inflammation is at the trigger of all of this. It doesn't matter, well, I've been diagnosed with ... It doesn't matter. It's always inflammation that's pulling on your chain, breaking at the weak link that manifests with the diagnosis you got. Okay, that's the first concept. So Fasano, in talking about the perfect storm, and this paper is available on Google, just type in Fasano, F-A-S-A-N-O, all disease begins in the leaky gut, and it pops right up, and you read it, and general public reading it may have to read it 2 or 3 times to get, there's a lot of nuances, some geek words in there, but the big picture comes through very clear. All right, there's a perfect storm in the development of chronic inflammatory diseases, meaning you're set up for it. That's the perfect storm. Well, what does that mean? Well, there are 5 factors in the perfect storm. First is your genetics. Now, the genetics are the deck of cards you were dealt in this lifetime. For over 70% of the genes that we have, having a gene for a disease does not mean you're getting the disease. It means it's the weak link in your chain, and if you pull too hard, then you might get this disease. Doesn't matter if it's BRCA for breast cancer or ApoE4 for Alzheimer's. It doesn't mean you're getting the disease.
Right. That's where the epigenetics comes in.
That's right. That's right. Over 34%, depending on the study, somewhere around a third of all people of European descent carry the genes for celiac disease. Somewhere around 30, 35%, depending on the study, but only 1 to 4% get the disease. So wait a minute. I've got the gene, but I don't have the disease. Right, because you aren't pulling on that chain so hard in your lifestyle, and that chain hasn't broken, that link hasn't broken, where you get celiac disease. So that's true for all of our genes. And sometimes doctors say, well, we're going to turn this gene off. You can't turn genes off. And I always say to doctors, stop saying that. Genes don't operate on on-off switches. Genes operate on dimmer switches. And you can certainly dim down the genes of inflammation pulling on your chain, and you can turn up the brightness of the genes of anti-inflammation. For example, you eat a cup of blueberries a day, every day, and in 3 years, your brain's working better than it was 13 years ago. We knew that back in the early 1990s, that some of the compounds in blueberries calm down the inflammation in the brain, and your circuits are firing. You're on all 8 cylinders. You're going to town with brain function. So that's turning up the genes of inflammation and turning down the genes of anti-inflammation.
Right.
So that's number 1. Number 1 is your genes of the perfect storm. Number 2 are environmental triggers, which you just referred to as epigenetics, which means around the genes. What's the environment around the genes? Are you eating ding-dongs and ho-hos? Are you eating French fries, bad fats? Because your brain is made up of the walls of your brain cells operate like lazy Susans. In a Oriental restaurant, sometimes you've got this thing in the middle of the table, you put all the food on it and it swings around so everyone can like take a serving and then pass it around. That's a lazy Susan. When I was younger, you go to the doctor, and if they need a urine sample, you go in the bathroom and you collect the sample. You put it on this thing on the wall, and it turns around, and on the other side of the wall is the nurse to run the test. That's a lazy Susan. Your brain cells operate as lazy Susans, and it's called the viscosity. How thick is that brain cell, which is made up of fats. And if you're eating mostly bad fats, what happens is that your lazy Susans get rusty because the bad fats are too thick and your body can't use them. But when you start eating more fish and taking fish oil, within 6 months, your lazy Susans are working much better. Your brain function goes up. And the studies in the Journal of the American Medical Association show every child that takes fish oils, their attention who were diagnosed with attention deficit, 6 months later, every parent or child reported improvement just by taking fish oils because their lazy Susans are working better, right? That's an environmental trigger that's activating genes to get genes to function better or not. So number 2 is the environmental triggers that have their fingers on the knob of your dimmer switches. Number 3, when you have too many environmental triggers that are inflammatory, and the most common inflammatory triggers are what's on the end of your fork. That's most common. When you have too many inflammatory triggers, you alter the balance of the good guys and the bad guys in the gut. And too many bad guys, not enough good guys. And the geek term for that is dysbiosis. And it just means too many bad guys, not enough good guys. But now you've got too many bad guys in your gut. Now here's a pearl that you may be familiar with, or perhaps not. 36% of all the small molecules in our blood are the exhaust of the bacteria in your gut. 36% of, if I exercise and I exercise too hard and the next day my muscles sore, we know that's lactic acid. That's just the exhaust of the muscles. And I produced too much of it and my system couldn't get rid of it. And now you're sore for a day or two. That's just the exhaust of the muscle cells. Your bacteria create exhaust. We call them metabolites. That's just the geek word for the exhaust. And so 36% of everything, all the small molecules in your bloodstream are the exhaust of the bacteria in your gut. So when you have too many bad guys and not enough good guys, the exhaust you produce is an inflammatory exhaust as opposed to an anti-inflammatory exhaust. And it activates the genes of inflammation. Well, when that happens, we have to understand this visual. Mrs. Patient, your digestive system is a tube. It goes from the mouth to the other end, and about 20, 25 feet long, winds around in the center there. If you could take a donut and just stretch a donut out, and if you look down the center of the donut, that's your digestive tract. So when you swallow food, it's not really in your body yet, it's in the tube, right? And the food has to go through the walls of the tube to get into the bloodstream. And your bloodstream's just a highway. I mean, it goes everywhere and it's all going the same direction, but there's no lanes of traffic. Everything's bouncing into each other, but it's just a highway. So how do you get the proteins of chicken into the bloodstream so your body can make new muscle cells and bone cells and brain cells? How does that happen? Well, you can't put pieces of chicken in the bloodstream. That'd be very toxic, poisonous to the body. So the proteins have to be broken down. So think of a pearl necklace. When you eat food, it's like a pearl necklace. And the acid in your stomach and the enzymes in your mouth and the saliva and the digestive enzymes act as scissors to break down that pearl necklace, to cut it down smaller and smaller, snip, 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 until you're down to each pearl of the pearl necklace. That's called an amino acid.
Right.
Now, the inside lining of your gut is lined with cheesecloth, so that only really small molecules can go through the cheesecloth to get into the bloodstream. So when you start chewing, and we should chew 10 to 20 times, and we chew 3 and then swallow, gallop it down as opposed to chewing and masticating. But when that food goes down into the gut, the molecules are too big to go through the cheesecloth. They've got to go further down the digestive tract. That's why it's 20 to 25 feet long. Further down the digestive tract, being snipped apart, smaller and smaller and smaller, until they're so small, they go right through the cheesecloth into the bloodstream. That's called absorption. It's a great system, works really well. But when you have too many bad guys and not enough good guys in the gut, you activate this inflammation in your gut, it tears the cheesecloth. When you tear the cheesecloth, now larger molecules of the really good food you're eating go through the tears in the cheesecloth before they're supposed to. They're called macromolecules, big molecules, and they go right through into the bloodstream. Now they're on the highway. That's number 4. Number 1 was genetics. Number 2 is the environmental triggers that have their hands on the dimmer switches, up or down, inflammation, anti-inflammation. Number 3, when you have too many bad guys in the gut, dysbiosis, which causes the inflammation that tears the cheesecloth. That's number 4. And now you have these macromolecules, these big molecules that get into the bloodstream, and they're off on the highway, and your immune system says, whoa, what's that? That's not something I can use to make new bone cells. I better fight that. Now you make antibodies to chicken. That's number 5, systemic inflammation. That's the perfect storm in the development of chronic inflammatory diseases, 14 of the 15 top causes of death. So at Harvard, what they're teaching is all disease begins in the leaky gut. It's those macromolecules that get through into the bloodstream and they're off on the highway that you have to prevent. So how do you do that? You heal the gut.
Right.
So it's all of this inflammation that's everywhere in your body because it's in the bloodstream. And the more leaky gut you have, the more macromolecules come through, the more responsive your immune system trying to protect you creates this inflammation. And that inflammation in your bloodstream activates genes in your brain, for example, of inflammation. Now you get a leaky brain. And now, depending on what genes in your brain are activated and where the inflammation is occurring, you get migraines, you get seizures, you get brain fog. It doesn't matter. The mechanism, the symptoms don't matter. This mechanism is part of what's fueling them all. It's not the answer to everything, obviously, but it's fueling them all. So you have to stop throwing gasoline on the fire, irrespective of what is it depression or anxiety? It doesn't matter. You have to stop throwing gasoline on the fire and then address whatever the other imbalances are. One last point. In the same article, Pisano tells us there are 2 primary triggers, major was his word, major triggers that have been identified that tear the cheesecloth. One is exposure to too much bad bacteria and its exhaust called LPS. Lipopolysaccharides. And 2 is gluten.
Yep.
Those are the 2, not dairy, not soy, not egg. Now, some people are sensitive to dairy and will cause a problem, or to soy or to egg, but every human has this response to gluten, to wheat. Every human has a response that tears the cheesecloth every time you eat it. Maureen Leonard at Harvard, very famous gastroenterologist, did a literature review of over 60 studies on this topic. And her conclusion in the Journal of the American Medical Association was gluten activates transient intestinal permeability, leaky gut, in all humans who consume it. So if you're listening to this today, and if you consider yourself human, this means you, without exception.
Right.
Without it, and remember, the ratio is 8 to 1. For every 1 that gets gut symptoms, there are 8 that don't. So don't tell me you feel fine when you eat wheat. It doesn't matter how you feel. What matters is are you creating an inflammatory condition in your body that's going to be pulling on the chain and manifest wherever your genetic vulnerabilities are?
Mhm.
All right, I'll pause now.
You did a brilliant explanation, and I love your analogies so that the average person can understand in a real. I do the same thing, where I try to find similar analogies outside of us to understand what's
Yes.
happening in us. And there's a couple things that I still do in my talks. Is your slinky? You once brought out a slinky into the audience.
Right.
I've used that example because it's perfect. People really get it when you use a slinky. There was another thing that has always stuck in my mind that you've talked about with osteoporosis. I've had a number of patients with osteoporosis, even as young as 26 years old. And that you have said that if you have osteoporosis at a young age, the number one cause is celiac disease. But that's not. I mean, we're talking, and I know we're talking just about not just talking about celiac disease as you just explained, but it's important to understand that if you have a chronic disease and you're suffering from it, whether it's active or chronic, that gluten has got to be out of your body as part of
yeah.
part of the plan.
I never say everyone needs to give up wheat. I never say that because you sound like a nutcase. It's the most prevalent food in the world today.
Right.
And it saved millions and millions of lives from starvation. We can't ignore that. But if you have a health condition that's not responding the way you want it to,
Right.
then you just have to test accurately. Is my immune system fighting wheat? If it is, that means every time you eat it, you're throwing gasoline on the fire for whatever your symptoms are. But you just have to test, and you can't do the tests that most doctors were trained on, which is to look for celiac disease. Of course, that's included in the testing, but that's not the test. That's a historic misconception from the 1980s and the 1990s. We didn't know any better. Now we know much better. And the test is called the wheat zoomer because you zoom in on the problem. No test is now. I'm on stage all over the world, but I've not been to the Far East, so I can't say nowhere in the world is there a better test. But in Europe, South America, Latin America, North America, there's no test that compares to accuracy and comprehensiveness like the wheat zoomer.
Awesome. Yeah, that's what I usually recommend if people really want to know if wheat is something that they need to keep out of their diet for good.
Yeah. May I tweak that just a little bit? Sure. I don't care if people want to know. Most people don't want to know. Right. Don't tell me my pizza's a problem, right? Don't tell me that. But our job as practitioners is to identify the triggers causing the symptoms that they have as functional medicine practitioners. Of course, help them feel better as quickly as possible. Sometimes that means medication, right? If it helps, but we're also looking for where are the symptoms coming from, so you won't need that medication forever. I mean, every high blood pressure patient that comes to us on blood pressure medication, we make sure to tell them, please call your doctor's office in the next day or two where you've had this prescription for your medication, and let them know that you're working with a team now, you're changing your diet, you're going to start exercising, you might take a couple of vitamins, but could they monitor you? Because we are telling you, you're going to need less medication. Right. And if you keep taking the same amount of medication, you can get really dizzy and pass out because your blood pressure goes too low.
I literally did that on Wednesday, 2 days ago with one of my patients who was on 4 blood pressure medications.
Yeah, and these guys are trying, but doctor number 1 doesn't really know what doctor number 2 is doing, and doctor number 3 is just going to say, well, I can go right in there and not mess with what everybody else is doing, and they're just piling it on top. But but that's exactly what you have to do with every prescription. As you start working with a functional medicine practitioner, is just recognize my need for this medication to address the symptoms is going to go down because the symptoms are going down.
Right, right. So yeah, and so when when people do want testing, and most people don't necessarily want the testing, but there are a few who will insist on it, because it's for, especially when it's kids and the family is trying to get their child to change their diet. It's almost like they need the proof that
Right.
this is worth making the change, because it's so hard, especially with kids. So then the next question is, well, for how long? How long will we have to do this? How long does it have to stay out? And, again, I think it's dependent on what chronic disease they have or chronic issues they have, and whether or not that it has resolved. But when it comes for the long haul, in terms of long term, if they've demonstrated a reaction to gluten, whether it's through testing or that they've gotten better with taking gluten out and show reactions repeatedly, then obviously the answer is yes, you have to keep gluten out of their body. But if they put it back in, and let's say they do have an autoimmune disease, but they're not having any immediate reaction with putting it back in, my answer to that is that, well, you have an autoimmune disease, and especially with what you just demonstrated with Dr. Fasano's work, it's really important to keep it out, regardless of whether or not you react immediately or a couple of days later or not at all. It's important to keep it out completely. Would you agree with that?
That's a very healthy response from a practitioner with really good rationale, and it's close, but let's say it this way. If you get a vaccination for measles, they give you a shot of the bug, measles. And your brain says, whoa, what's that in the bloodstream? I better fight that. And your brain says to your immune system, you, general, and you've got Army, Air Force, Marine Corps generals in the immune system sitting around with nothing to do. You now are General Measles. Take care of this. General Measles builds an assembly line. The assembly line starts produces soldiers, special forces, that are trained to go after measles. They're called antibodies. So measles antibodies go out into the bloodstream, and they're looking everywhere for measles, and they're really high performance antibodies. They just shoot measles. That's all they do. When all of the measles bugs have been destroyed from the vaccination, General Measles, who's watching this, says, okay, turn off the assembly line. We don't need more soldiers here right now. I mean, if you were to test yourself for antibodies to measles, you shouldn't have any right now, unless you've been exposed, but you shouldn't have any. But General Measles is vigilant the rest of his life. And he just sits around with nothing to do. But if you're on an airplane, and oh, by the way, that process of building the assembly line and producing the antibodies, that goes on for 2 to 4 months. And then General Measles turns off the assembly line, and you no longer have measles antibodies in your bloodstream. And the antibodies have a lifespan of 6 weeks to 10 weeks, somewhere, depending on which ones. So we're looking at 3 to 4 months of measles antibodies from a vaccination. So now you're on an airplane. General Measles has turned off the assembly line. Now you're on an airplane, and the guy behind you just came from Mozambique and coughs in the air a bunch of measles bug. And you inhale the measles bug. Well, General Measles, who's sitting around, just looks dormant. He's always watching. And he's, whoa, measles. And he just has to flip the switch. Now the assembly line turns back on. You don't have to build it. It's already there. And in one day, you've got measles antibodies going after special forces. Look, oh, there he is over there. Going after the measles bug that you inhaled from the guy sitting behind you on the airplane. And it never has a chance to multiply and get a hold in your body. That's the purpose of vaccinations, right? And it works really well. General Measles is called a memory B cell. Now, here's why I told you all that. And there are many papers on this, many. The only food, if you make antibodies to it, that produces memory B cells is wheat. You don't make memory B cells to eggs. You don't make memory B cells to soy. You don't make memory B cells to dairy. So if you give up dairy and all your mucus goes away and you get better digestive function, you change your microbiome, you may be able to have dairy again, not a problem. There's no memory B cells for dairy. But wheat, you have the tiniest exposure, general gluten, flips the switch. Now the assembly line's up and running, making the antibodies, special forces out there, and the assembly line is on for 2 months, 2 to 4 months, making antibodies. And if the weak link in your chain was to myelin and you had MS, you put in remission, now within a couple of weeks, the myelin antibodies are back up, because that's the cross-reactivity you have with wheat. And we're not talking about all that geeky stuff today, but just know that's what happens. Or if it's a thyroid, now your thyroid antibodies that you got down to normal are elevated again, killing off thyroid, killing off thyroid, killing off. And that goes for 2 to 4 months. So you have to, all of our doctors have to be able to explain to patients, and use my examples, use any you want, but you have to explain. First, our doctors have to read the science so they understand it in their heart and soul. And they can say, you know, with soy or eggs or dairy, it's possible you can have it again. It's possible. But with wheat, once you've crossed that line of tolerance and you have elevated antibodies, that means you have memory B cells to wheat, it's permanent. Without exception, it's permanent.
So it had nothing to do with whether or not you have symptoms, even if you have no symptoms.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. It has nothing to do with, I feel fine when I eat the wheat in Europe. Doesn't matter. You're still activating that inflammatory response, and you're going to have 2 to 4 months of antibodies, not only to wheat, but the weak link in your chain, wherever that weak link in your chain is. That's the critical takeaway. And it's the only food on the planet that's been identified that does that.
Wow, that's great to know. I'm so glad you explained it that way with the examples and the memory B cells. That is awesome explanation. So where can people go from there in terms of, I'm glad you also explained that it's possible that you could potentially add other foods in. It seems to me that dairy and gluten are interconnected. And
well, that's actually true, and it's called cross-reactivity. And 50% of the people that have a sensitivity to dairy and to wheat, 50% of them, you give up wheat, but if you have dairy again, the wheat antibodies come back.
Right. Yes. And why is that? Can you explain?
Yeah, it's because proteins, it's like a brick wall. You know, if you look at a brick wall that's kind of an ornate brick wall that someone did some type of artistic building there, and they've got different designs on it, and or tile floors where they use different designs and colors, and proteins are made up of lots of bricks, and every protein is different. So I'll call them A, B, C, D when we're looking at each individual pearl of the pearl necklace. They're called amino acids, and wheat is A, B, C, D. Dairy is A, E, C, D. They're very similar. And so when you make the dairy antibodies, once again, the immune system sees that, and wait a minute, is that wheat or is that dairy? And then here come the wheat antibodies also. The memory B cell will activate the wheat antibodies from dairy consumption because the amino acid structure is very similar. Same problem happens with some bacteria and wheat, that if you get a viral infection, there's some viruses that do this, or a bacterial infection, some of them will trigger the production again of wheat antibodies, which pulls on the chain, and wherever your genetic weak link is, here comes the autoimmune disease.
Are those bacteria the ones that are associated with autoimmune diseases specifically?
Exactly. Klebsiella pneumoniae is very common. Proteus mirabilis is another one. Yeah, there's a group of them that are very common to see.
Right.
And when you eliminate wheat from your diet, many times, and I don't know anybody, any doctor who doesn't directly address the bacterial problem, but when the wheat antibodies go down, the bacterial antibodies start to go down. Your immune system starts working better to get rid of the bad bacteria.
Right, right. Yes. Yeah, we look for all of the root causes. I typically look for foods, infections, toxins, stress, and hormones.
Critically important.
Yes, and so you had mentioned environmental triggers are the fuel on the fire, creating the inflammation we experience. So, are there any other areas where you would look for sources triggering a person's immune system?
Yeah, there are many. There are many. A very common nowadays is mold.
Mm-hmm.
And Mrs. Patient, if you go on vacation for a week or two, when you come home, do you have to open the windows to air out the house? Well, yeah. Kind of stale in there. Yeah, that's mold. And so you need to have your home checked because you're inhaling that. You and your family are inhaling that 24/7. It goes right up to the memory center of the brain, causing inflammation. And when you start losing your sense of smell, which is very common, it's an indicator of the memory center of your brain. You're losing brain function. It's not your nose. It's the memory center of your brain. Now, the nerves of smell, called the olfactory nerves, interestingly, are the only nerves in the body. I've asked 3 neurologists, and they've all agreed to this. It's the only nerves in the body that have no screen before going into the brain. Absolutely nothing. Because our ancestors living on planet Earth, there was really nothing that they were exposed to on a regular basis that would be a problem, right? So you're smelling mold all day. There's no way to diffuse it, no way to minimize the amount that gets into your brain. It just goes shoop, right up there, and it triggers lots of inflammations, one of the causes of Alzheimer's. Dr. Dale Bredesen, the go-to guy in the world on reversing Alzheimer's, and he has hundreds of patients and hundreds of doctors who have learned his coursework now. He tells us that the most common of the 5 types of Alzheimer's is inhalation Alzheimer's. And so you always have to be looking at the home environment.
Right.
That's why we have a handout on our website, the dr.com/plant. We have the handout from NASA on houseplants. And they did the studies because their astronauts were going a little loopy in space. And they never talked about it with the press. But, he used to say, hello, shuttle, could you repeat that, please? And they would say it again, and the guys would just kind of look at each other and made a note. We have to figure out what's going on. They found out that the air on the space shuttles had way too much phthalates in it. Phthalates are the chemicals used to mold plastic, or we call them plasticizers.
Right.
And they were disrupting their brain function. So NASA financed the studies to how do we clean the air? And they identified a bunch of common houseplants. 2 6-inch houseplants in a 10 by 10 room absorb 74% of the toxins in the air.
Wow.
And so you go around, if you have 8 rooms in your house, you buy 20 little houseplants and you put, especially in your kids' bedrooms. And because the cabinet next to the bed, the nightstand,
Right.
if it's not solid wood, it's made with pressboard. Pressboard is soaked in formaldehyde,
Right.
which outgasses into the air for years. Well, I don't smell any formaldehyde, but that doesn't mean it's not there. It's just not at high doses.
Right.
Or the carpets that outgas flame retardant chemicals.
Right.
For years, they're outgassing. And houseplants.
It's all of that new carpet smell, new wallpaper, new magazines, new car, all those smells.
Right. Yeah. Those smells are very toxic to humans. And houseplants will absorb 74% of those toxins in the air and generate oxygen instead in the air.
Are there specific houseplants?
Yeah, there are. And so, we've got the whole list with the pictures of the plants. And I've seen those before. Oh, that's mother-in-law's tongue, and so I don't know the names of the other plants. But we've got the list and which chemicals each plant absorbs, and that's great.
I would love to share with my audience that list if you don't mind sharing.
You're welcome to, of course.
Awesome. Yeah, that is great. Yeah, so chemicals, those are all under toxins. Yeah, mold toxicity. I talk to my patients a lot about that. I actually have 4 videos that I've created to educate my patients about mold toxicity. And it doesn't have to be just neurodegenerative diseases. It's amazing how, again, where's that weak link that you're
Right,
talking about? For
right,
some people, it's skin rashes. For
right,
some people, it's anxiety and depression, and it's not necessarily neurological. So yeah, it takes a time to hunt down the root causes and to address each and every one of them. But ultimately, it starts in the gut. And usually mold is something you have to address before you even do the gut restoration. It's the one area that you have to move out of the moldy environment and have it remediated before you can really embark on a full gut restoration. Uh,
right, right.
uh,
If you're living in a moldy environment, you're throwing gasoline on the fire 24/7.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, what can you tell us about how food is connected to anxiety, depression, or other types of mental health conditions?
Well, uh, food is the fuel on the fire.
Hmm.
I'll say it differently. Fuel is the fingertips on the dial of your dimmer switches.
Right.
And some foods turn up the genes of anti-inflammation, some foods turn up the genes of inflammation. And you want to have more genes of anti-inflammation. And as you said in the beginning, it's epigenetics around the genes.
Right.
And that's what epigenetics means, is what's influencing that gene expression. Are you
Right.
turning it up or calming it down? And foods, that's one of the primary things about food. That's what it does, is they're messengers. They're messengers of health or they're messengers of disease. I have yet to see a credible article on French fries being a messenger of health. You don't deep fry things at high temperature and make them healthy for you.
Right.
So I'm sorry, but deep fried butter or deep fried pickles just won't cut it.
Right.
Well, I can have it once in a while. Well, we'll put that on your tombstone. He wanted it once in a while. You monitor your inflammatory cascade. And when your inflammatory cascade is low, maybe you can swing out a little bit and have something that's not really great for you, but not a food, not gluten, because your body response will be 2 to 4 months from a single exposure.
Right.
But other foods like dairy or something, well, maybe you can a little bit if your inflammatory index is low, but when your inflammatory index is high, you need to be as squeaky clean as possible.
Right, right. No, that's really good to know. You've done an excellent job explaining all of those factors that are involved, and especially with the way gluten in particular is the thing that stands out the most in creating that inflammatory cascade.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, the answer is yes, you've got to keep it out. Once you've passed that tolerance level or inability to tolerate it, then there is no looking back when it comes to gluten.
That's exactly right. And how do you know? You do the test. Doesn't
Hmm.
matter how you feel, you do the test.
Right.
And it's a highly accurate and sensitive test, the wheat zoomer, just right on the money. Like no other technology that's out there. When this technology came out, the lab opened in 2015. It caused huge waves in the laboratory medicine industry
Hmm.
because the other laboratories don't like it at all. Because when you compare, it's called sensitivity and specificity, meaning how accurate is it. You compare this technology, it's called silicone chip technology for the Zoomer test. No one compares to it, absolutely no one. And all the other labs look bad
Hmm.
and they don't like that. So there's all the politics about it and all that. So when you're working with a functional medicine doctor who is not in a hospital setting, they have a little more freedom to order the tests that they think will really help you to understand more. If you're in a hospital setting, that's all politics to try to get the tests in there.
Right, right. Awesome. Well, Dr. Tom, thank you so much for all of your wonderful knowledge and all the work that you have done for people on this planet, because you are internationally known, and you do a great job of explaining things and really breaking it down in a way that people can understand. And and emphasize what's really important to take away. So I appreciate you and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.